I began noticing as I saw a lot of patients that what I was seeing clinically didn't really fit what I had learned in neuroscience. I had a little girl who was born missing at least half of her brain. She had basically half her head was just full of spinal fluid. And I told her family, well, I didn't think she would do too well. I didn't really have a lot of hope for her. As she grew up, she was perfectly normal. She's a bright, active, normal 25-year-old woman now. I have a bunch of other patients with kind of the same story. It doesn't mean that it's a good thing to be missing a lot of your brain, but there's a lot of stuff out there I think that neurosurgeons see that that's not in the neuroscience textbooks. And I came to realize, reading these textbooks and knowing some neuroscientists who are great people, that they don't have a lot of contact with the brain. That is, that most neuroscientists have never seen a living human brain. None of them have ever operated on one. And neurosurgeons are in a remarkable position here, meaning that we see these patients in the clinic. We then expose their brains, we do our surgery, then we examine them postoperatively, we look at all their films, and you get a real strong intuitive sense of how the mind relates to the brain. So I got my intuitive sense was that the textbooks were really, really off base, that they were just laboratory stuff. This wasn't real world stuff that I was reading.
Right.
With some exceptions. There was some real world stuff in there, but it just didn't fit. So I began looking into the neuroscience literature. I began looking into philosophy because I realized that a lot of the problem with the way that neuroscience was looking at the brain and the mind wasn't so much scientific as it was conceptual, that they were holding to conceptions like the idea that the mind is entirely caused by the physical brain. That really is a philosophical idea. It's not a scientific idea per se,
That's right.
at least first. And so I read a lot of philosophy, I read a lot about philosophy of mind, and I read a lot of neuroscience. And that combined with my experience led me to really see things differently. And I began blogging for the Discovery Institute back about, it must be almost 15 years ago, and writing a lot on mind-brain stuff. And it got to the point where my colleague said, really you ought to put this together in a book because it's kind of a coherent and I think very interesting story. And I went through a religious conversion about 25 years ago, and I realized that what had blinded me to the reality of God and to the truth, not only about God, but about science and about the world and about myself, was atheism and materialism. And I want to convey to people, that's kind of my crusade right now, is to convey to people that materialism and atheism are lies. They're not true. At least philosophical mistakes, if not outright lies. And the real science and the real truth lies elsewhere. It lies in the Christian view of the world and the Christian view of human beings.
You've done a lot of work to unpack those ideas for yourself in your own life, and I want to make sure we don't skip over that. You have a kind of a dramatic story of your coming to know the Lord during the hospital encounter that you had. Why don't you tell us that story just so we understand how exactly you went from this atheist, materialist neuroscientist to a person who believed in God? That's a big leap. I was raised in the church, so it was kind of more natural for me, but you had a pretty dramatic encounter there. Why don't you tell us about that, Mike?
Sure. As I said, I never had any animus towards Christianity or towards God. I just thought it was a myth, and I just couldn't. I felt I'd had to leave my brain at the church door if I went inside.
Right.
So I began having what I call hauntings, which are these feelings that I would get when I was working or just by myself, or that I didn't know why I was alive, where I came from, where I was going, why there was anything. And it was a creepy feeling, but a fascinating feeling. The analogy was like if you wake up some morning in this huge mansion that you've never seen before, and you have no idea why you're there. You have no memory of where you came from. And you have to explain this. If you go about your daily life living in this mansion, never asking the fundamental question is, how did I end up here? Like, what's this all about? So I thought a lot about it, and I was thinking that maybe Christianity had some answers to that, but I was still a bit resistant. And my youngest child was born, a boy, and when he was a few months old, we noticed that he wasn't smiling. He wasn't making eye contact with us. So we took him to a pediatric neurologist, and we were afraid that he was autistic, and afraid that he. And the neurologist said he's kind of young. It's really hard to say. Let's give him some more time. As the months went by, he still wasn't really interacting with us, and so I was pretty scared. And autism really scared me. The idea that a child could be severely disconnected in a way that he didn't know me and so on was a very painful thing. So one night I was seeing a consult at an outside hospital. It was a Catholic hospital. And after I'd seen the patient, I just couldn't get this off my mind. So I went into the chapel of the hospital. And I knelt down in front of the altar, and I said, God, I don't know if you exist. This is a last-ditch effort because I got no other options. But the thought that my son wouldn't know me, that my child wouldn't have a connection to me, is too much to bear for me. It's not a burden I can handle. So if you exist, please take this off my shoulders. And I heard a voice, only time in my life I've ever heard a voice. It was inside my head, but it wasn't my voice. And the voice said, but that's what you're doing to me. And I was overwhelmed. I basically collapsed on the floor. And I realized that God was showing me what he felt like when a child of his doesn't know him and doesn't connect to him. So I promised him I wouldn't do it to him anymore. And I asked him to heal my son. And a couple of days later was my son's 6th birthday party. And I get home from work, and he's a perfectly normal child. He's smiling and making contact, and he's now a young man in his 20s, and he's a very normal, happy, healthy guy. I promised God I would never be autistic to him anymore. So that kind of began my willingness to talk publicly about what I was seeing. I kind of felt that I had something I wanted to tell people, not only about my experience with God, but about the truth about the way the human soul interacts with the brain and the body. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Incredible. This story is just amazing. And it kind of became missional for you then just to share this insight with your life and in your work. So it's fascinating how God communicates with each of us in different ways. And I appreciate you being willing to share your faith like that. What do you think about the idea? Just before I say that, let me say this. For any listener who hasn't been listening for a while, if you're not familiar with some of the terms that Mike and I are going to talk about today, we talk about materialism. And materialism basically is this philosophical idea that everything can be explained by the workings of the material from which it's made. And particularly with neuroscience, the idea is that basically everything about you is the function of a neuron in your brain. And so every single thing about your life and your personality, and even the idea that you have a mind or a self, is really just the artifact of some electrical activity in a cell in your brain, right, Mike?
Yes. It's basically just the viewpoint that there's nothing spiritual in the world. The vast majority of materialists are also atheists. It's the viewpoint that God doesn't exist, that there's no afterlife, that we don't have souls, and that we are essentially we're really meat robots. That's most materialists would prefer we don't say it that way, but that's really what materialism is. That we're just robots made of meat.
That's right.
And that viewpoint of things goes back to Descartes, back in the 17th century, who was a philosopher who himself was not a materialist, but he said that human beings were a composite of an immaterial substance, the soul, and a body that was just a machine. And as a philosophical viewpoint, there are many good Christians who accept Descartes' kind of dualism, it's called. But what happened was, over the next few centuries, as materialists kind of came to dominate the scientific and philosophical world, and they took Descartes' idea that we're like a ghost in a machine, and they just got rid of the ghost. So the only thing that's left is the machine. If you deny that we have a soul, then we're just a machine, and we're just a biological machine. And then they're stuck with the idea of trying to explain how we have a mind when they were the ones who got rid of the mind. And so they get all these crazy theories about how the mind happens. And we end up in the mess we're in now in neuroscience, where neuroscientists really don't have a clue as to how mental things come out of the brain. But if one accepts a Christian worldview, particularly the worldview of Thomas Aquinas, I think, who is one of the great saints and philosophers in Christian history, it's much easier to understand how the mind and the brain relate, and that we have spiritual souls.
That's right. And if you accept the idea that we're just made of the stuff from which that our minds are just made up of the function of the cells that we're made of, What does that say about the purpose and meaning of our existence?
Yeah, well, it really drains it of purpose and meaning. If God doesn't exist and if we are meat robots, then of course there really isn't any meaning to our lives. We can try to fake it. We can pretend that there's meaning, but that's not real. And frankly, it's a terribly bleak way of looking at the world. I mean, the only pleasure you can have in the world is just pleasure you sort of create for yourself. It's a very, very depressing way of understanding life. And it's a lie, and it's not true.
Yeah, and you can say that with some authority, because when I said a while ago materialism is philosophical rather than scientific, that's because we say that because materialism can't be proved from a scientific standpoint. So you have to have some faith at some point that that's a correct worldview, because it's not a scientifically derived worldview, right?
Right. Materialism not only can't be proven, if you really believe in materialism, it's difficult to even believe in like having a rational process. Like, for example, the proposition that materialism is true is a proposition, and a proposition is not a material thing. A proposition is a mental thing. So even the very process of reasoning falls apart if you really take materialism seriously. So materialists have to keep violating their own basic metaphysical principles to even make their own arguments. So it's I think there are several perfectly valid or perfectly reasonable ways of looking at the world, different kinds of dualism. Idealism is another way, that everything is mental. I think that is a respectable way of looking at it. I don't think materialism is a respectable way of looking at the world. I think it's just a mistake. It's like saying that 2 + 2 = 5 is mathematics. It's not mathematics, it's just a mistake. And materialism is just a really bad idea.
I had a conversation on the podcast a couple of years ago with a neuroscientist named Sharon Diericks. I don't know if you know Sharon.
Oh, yeah, sure.
She wrote a great book called Am I Just My Brain? But
Excellent.
she said her biggest problem with materialism is you can't live the worldview with any integrity, because the whole idea that our minds and ourselves, if you think about it, is just an artifact of neuronal function, and that there's no real meaning and purpose in life, that eliminates the idea and possibility of free will. And so it's ridiculous to think that if your entire life and everything you do is programmed by your neurons, why would you have an argument with somebody about the validity of your worldview? Why would it matter?
Precisely. It's the free will thing is I think is a fascinating thing. It's fascinating not because there's any honest question as to whether we have free will. Of course we have free will. What is fascinating about it, it's a fascinating psychiatric thing. That is, that how does one live a life in which you deny free will, but you try to live as a normal human being. If you're denying free will, you're just lying to yourself. A good example of that is that there's a biologist named Jerry Coyne who has a book called Why Evolution is True, and I've debated him a lot online over the years about the issue of free will. And he put up a blog post a couple of years ago showing his car in a parking lot. Somebody had dented his fender and then drove off. And he was angry. He says, some guy dented my fender in the parking lot. So I wrote him that if free will isn't real, then the guy had no choice but to dent your fender. And you have every bit as much reason to blame the car as you do to blame the driver. So just the fact that you're outraged that somebody did something to you that was unethical means you must on some level believe in free will.
That's right.
So in fact, I mean, let's face it, first of all, what a person believes in is not just what they say. Belief is a totality of behavior.
That's right.
If you ask an embezzler if he believes in being financially honest and he says yes, you can say, well, you're lying because you're an embezzler. You don't really believe in being financially honest. So no one who denies free will, and there are a lot of scientists and a lot of materialists who do, no one who denies free will lives their life as if free will isn't real. So it's a charade. I see it more as kind of a materialist virtue signaling. That is, to deny free will publicly is to signal to other materialists that you are to be taken seriously. I follow the rules, but it's a pretense. It's a lie, and I'll believe that they really don't believe in free will when they start living their lives as if they and everyone around them are really meat robots with no freedom at all.